Hello and welcome to a very special all-Florida Webathon Week Reason podcast. I'm Peter Suderman, Florida resident throughout the 1990s, and today I am joined by two Florida men, Zach Weissmueller and CJ Ciaramella, as well as one Florida woman, Stephanie Slade. Everyone say hi.
Hey.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Great to be with you all today. So since this is Webathon Week, I just want to start by saying that if you like Reason, if you like our podcasts, our magazine, our website, our videos, you can support us by going to reason.com/donate. That's reason.com/donate. Your donations make our work possible. So this is an all Florida podcast, and you might be wondering, why Florida? Well, for one thing, the latest and greatest issue of Reason magazine is a Florida special issue, jam-packed with stories and commentary and cocktail recipes direct from the Sunshine State. For another thing, Florida is, for whatever reason, at the center of so many of America's political and cultural debates. It's where Donald Trump goes to hide secret documents in the bathroom. It's where Trump rival Ron DeSantis just goes to the bathroom. It's the home state to crypto conferences and Disney World and special private communities with weird tax statuses that no one understands, dysfunctional property insurance schemes, Medicare fraud, Matt Gaetz, Big Sugar, and a whole lot of really, really big, really unpleasant snakes called Burmese pythons. Florida is the epicenter of American weirdness. If it matters to America, it probably matters in some way or another to the state of Florida. And there's another reason, too, which is that Reason itself is somewhat strangely overstocked on Florida men and Florida women, people who either live in the state now or who previously lived in the state at some point in the past. That includes myself and all of my co-panelists today. So I'd like to start by going around the group and getting a brief sense of your personal history with Florida. When were you there? Why were you there? Or why are you there, if you still are? Zach, let's start with you.
Sure. I'm a native Floridian. I was born in Orlando, Florida. Then after graduating college, I moved out to California and lived there for 15 years. And in October 2021, I decided to get the hell out of California and come back. And now I'm living in Jacksonville, North Florida.
And so that was a decision that had something to do with COVID policy, with the pandemic, or was it that you were just tired of paying California's tax rates?
I was getting tired of that, and I would say that the COVID pandemic accelerated my decision to move back to Florida. I felt like the Sunshine State may have been drawing me slowly back, but this made me, pack up and run as fast as I could.
CJ, how about you?
Well, my mom's side of the family lived in Orlando, so I traveled there when I was a kid quite a bit. And some of my earliest memories are like chasing lizards around in the scrub grass in my grandma's front yard. But I grew up in Oregon, so Florida was always a very exotic and kind of interesting place to me because it's just the geographic and cultural and spiritual opposite of Oregon. The vibes are just totally different. But in 2018, my wife got a chance to work remotely, and we both loved scuba diving. We had gotten scuba certified a few years prior, and we were just obsessed with it and thought wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could live somewhere where we could scuba dive all the time? And so we ended up moving to the Florida.
And that place is Florida, yeah.
Florida has the only barrier reef in the United States. So we moved to the Florida Keys and rented an apartment sight unseen in 2018 and went on down. It was kind of absurd, and it still strikes me as absurd every day that we did this. But coming up on 5 years later, we are still here in the Florida Keys. And, Florida has become kind of more annoying the longer we've been here because the government seems to be getting more and more feckless and ineffective at doing basic government things and all of the culture war stuff. But I have found that we did get what we were looking for in terms of the environment and the ocean. Florida, despite its reputation as being very sprawly and sort of, concrete and stuff like that, still has a lot of just incredibly beautiful nature and wildlife. There's this sort of austere beauty to it. It doesn't impress you like the West with huge mountains and things like that, but it has this sort of if you take Florida on its own terms, the Florida's environment on its own terms, it is really striking. And I found that I really do enjoy the wildlife and the nature environment here. So that's basically my Florida story.
I feel very lucky that we managed to get you for this podcast, that you were actually above water and able to speak into a microphone, because otherwise we were going to end up in like an Aquaman situation where it's like, how are they all talking? They're underwater. You own a boat though, right? Like you went that far into the Florida man identity very quickly.
I sunk deep into the Florida man. I have an old
Hopefully
boat.
your boat has not also sunk deep.
No, it's unsinkable. It's a Boston whaler. The unsinkable legend, I'll have you know.
All right, Slade. What's your Florida story?
So for simplicity's sake, I usually say that I grew up in Florida. That's somewhat misleading because my dad was in the Army when I was young. We moved around a lot the first 10 years of my life, but we moved to the Tampa Bay area when I was 10. And so I did middle school and high school in Tampa and then attended the University of Florida. And I feel obligated to say that I was in the graduating class that had the best 4 years of college sports that any graduating class of any college has ever had. We had 2 basketball national championships, 2 football national championships, and Tim Tebow's Heisman Trophy in the years that I was a student at UF. So it was a pretty great experience, though admittedly I moved up to DC immediately after graduation and I couldn't wait to get out of the state.
So you were very happy with the sports part of it, but not with the being there and living in Florida part? That's
right. And I think the thing that I associate most with Florida and that most people find attractive about the state and that caused me to want to flee is the climate. The sort of 9 months of summer phenomenon is not appealing to me at all. DC's summer is just as bad and in fact sometimes worse than where I'm from in Tampa, but at least it ends after 3 months and you get 4 seasons. Here we don't get that in Florida, and I really enjoy the seasons.
Yeah, I appreciate Florida much more now that I don't live there. When I lived there, I hated going to the beach. But now I go back and I'm like, this is the white sand, the sparkling emerald green water. So I grew up in the Panhandle. I moved there when I was 8 or 9 years old, around 1990. Lived there for about 15 years through about 2005, with some excursions to Kentucky for a few years of college. Mostly I was there because my family moved there, because my dad took a job at what was then a community college on the Gulf Coast. The town I lived in was called Niceville. It's just a few miles from Destin, which is the town where they shot Jaws 2. Also about a half an hour from Seaside, the super planned, so nice, it's kind of creepy, walkable community that is featured in The Truman Show. The Panhandle was a beach and tourist area that served the American South. It was at the time, I guess maybe still, known as the Redneck Riviera. And like we talked about, that was the term we used, because we loved it, or the people who lived there used affectionately anyway. Rand Paul vacationed there every year, is what I understand. J. Crew shot a number of their mid-'90s catalogs in the area just because the beaches were so perfect and beautiful and photogenic. It's also the home to a number of military bases, including Eglin, the Air Force's East Coast Research and Testing Facility. Today, they build the F-35s there, which is sort of the big new next generation fighter plane that is also a giant government boondoggle. But at the time, it was mostly focused on munitions. And what that meant was that I got used to hearing this giant alligator god sound that is actually the sound of a C-130 gunship banking and firing a few miles away. And sort of, if you see it in the movies, it'll sound like thump, 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 like sort of, you'll almost sort of hear the individual bullets firing. But if you are several miles away, it just sort of sounds like this great yawning groan. And I regularly went to sleep to the sound of bombers flying overhead, just sort of out on their evening sorties, and that soft thump of bombs landing at the range, which was not too far from my house. And so that was my childhood, and it seemed pretty normal at the time. But now I look back and I realize, that was not normal. And that is maybe a good place to start our discussion here, because nothing about Florida is normal. And Zach, you went to a very abnormal place in Florida, except maybe it's the most Florida place, most normal for Florida, the Villages. Yes. You wrote a piece titled "The Villages is America's Boomer Boomtown." So tell us about that.
Yeah, it's billed as America's largest active adult community, which is just a fancy way of saying a place where lots of retired people play golf and pickleball, and maybe
Wait, there's pickleball there now? There was no pickleball in Florida.
Oh yeah, there's pickleball galore. I believe the number was over 200 pickleball courts at this point and growing.
Totally overtaken shuffleboard.
Yeah, shuffleboard is not for active adults. These people want to move a little bit. Pickleball requires some like lateral motion, our wonderful editor, Catherine Mangu Ward, gave me permission to get a little weird with it, so I took her up on the offer and invited my wife to accompany me on what happened to be our anniversary. So we spent our anniversary in the Villages and contemplated, our future as Floridians. Like, would we ever live there? And I'm going to be a good marketer here and encourage you to read it for our conclusions. But what I can tell you is that the Villages is much more interesting than meets the eye. I'd always thought of it as just this kind of giant retirement home. As preparing for the story, I watched this great documentary about it called Some Kind of Heaven, which is this kind of like David Lynchian look at some of the strange characters inhabiting it. There's this octogenarian single dude who just lives out of his van and drifts around from community pool to community pool trying to pick up wealthy widows. So while I was there, I poked around a little bit for some of the wilder stories about swingers and drugs. And nobody was really fessing up to me, though they'd kind of wink and give me clues. One guy was like, look for the dice hanging from the golf carts. That's the signal. Another guy was like, I don't know anything about this, but I heard that a popped collar means that you're down. So there's all this just kind of like, gossip.
This is what active adult community really means.
Exactly, yeah. And there was like, for a while, there was this spate of news stories about like the rampant STDs in the Villages. When I looked into that, I didn't find much evidence. Like the STD rates are not any higher.
Should I ask how you looked into that, or do we not want to know?
Yeah. County health data. Okay, Peter, that's as exciting as it gets. But
I see the dice in your golf cart.
Yeah. But what's interesting about the Villages from a governance perspective is that it was all created by a private development company in the early 90s and is governed by these independent special districts that the state of Florida has authorized specifically for the purpose of managing land development. And there's almost 2,000 of them in the state. And it's why you'll see these master plan communities everywhere. And I think it probably it's at least a partial explanation as to why Florida's housing prices until very recently haven't really spiraled out of control in the same way that they did in California, for instance. There's this kind of ruthless efficiency to land development that's just unbelievable to witness in the Villages. They've got like this template locked in where they just plop down a walkable town square, build housing on the perimeter, terraform the golf courses, make the pickleball courts, then profit, buy more cheap pasture, because this is just like in the middle of like rural central Florida. And
I think this is also Elon Musk's plan for Mars.
Exactly. Yeah, the Villages on Mars would be pretty exciting. But the result basically is that the Villages has been the fastest growing metro in America over the past decade. Kind of incredible.
So I grew up in a Florida planned community that had been planned in the 1970s. And even when I moved there in the early 1990s, there were still subdivisions, little plots of it that were being developed. And I think the very last one was finished, I'm going to say sometime in the early aughts. I don't remember exactly when, but I remember going back from college one year and seeing, this is the last one in the plan that we've been hearing about now for 15 years. We actually lived on the first block that was developed. And there was this sort of gradations of like, here's where the most expensive homes are. There were multiple sort of little mini communities that were, some of which were gated privately, with the security guards, and some of which weren't. Did you get Slade? You said you kind of grew up in Florida. Did you have these types of communities around you?
Yeah, somewhat. I mean, I lived in a subdivision that was one of many subdivisions that surrounded a golf course. This is very common in Florida.
Yeah, mine was a golf course community as well.
It was maybe not quite as planned as the villages, but Zach, I'm so glad that you mentioned. And first of all, your piece is just freaking delightful. I love this piece so much.
Thank you.
And the reporting you did, and it's like a first person, almost Gonzo-esque. It's great. But I'm so glad that you mentioned that there are almost 2,000 of these special development districts in the state, and that their existence sort of enables something like the villages to exist, because of course the existence of these special development districts are most well known right now because of the controversy around Disney having one of them, which is where Disney World exists, and Governor DeSantis stripping Disney of its sort of governing capacity over the district that its parks sit on. And a lot of people I talk to about this, they think they assume that was a special carve out, that it's a crony capitalism, that Disney got the special carve out, that they're the only ones in the state that get the special ability to govern the district, that their property sits on. And in fact, that's not true at all. It's not. It's a thing that is widely available to hundreds of different types. The Daytona racetrack, to the villages, to airports, to all kinds of things have these districts, and it allows for all kinds of experiments in governance, which is one of the things that I think makes the economy of Florida so dynamic. So it's really, I think, a misnomer to think of that as crony capitalism. It's certainly not a thing that's limited to just Disney getting special perks.
Yeah, that's right. And the sort of thin reed that they rested that on was that Reedy Creek Special District is Disney's district, and it was created before a change to the Florida Constitution, where they kind of codified what the districts were supposed to be, and it didn't really change very much. There's this thing called home rule that kind of made very clear that like the counties still have like jurisdiction ultimately over this landmass, and so that's how they tried to justify, going after only the Reedy Creek Improvement District. And like they make a lot of hay over the fact that like Disney technically had the right to develop a nuclear power plant, which they never did. But honestly, would have been awesome if like Disney had like, nukes or something. That would be the true
That would
Magic
make me
Kingdom.
want to visit Tomorrowland, right? You want to go to that's the future. Is the little people mover?
Yeah, that's exactly why
powered.
That's exactly why that was written in there. Because I mean, imagine, this is like the 1950s, and like nuclear power is going to be the future, and like Epcot's going to be all powered by nuclear and everything. But yeah, it's very much a vindictive move. I mean, I interviewed Randy Fine, who plays a big role in CJ's story, and who was the brains behind the attack on Reedy Creek, and he basically admitted to me that this was because Disney opposed what became known as the Don't Say Gay education law.
Yeah, I think it's been pretty straightforward that it was political retribution. I mean, DeSantis has not really tried to hide that. But since we're bringing up politics here, the other thing that the villages are known for is being very kind of MAGA Trumpy, right? And having that built into part of their culture, almost in a sort of like a zany way. Like they're sort of like, they're really, it's not just that they're like, we like Trump. It's like, we love to throw in your face that we love Trump. They have these like boat parades and that sort of thing.
And the golf cart parades. Yep.
Right. All of the Florida modes of conveyance can be put into a Trump parade, apparently.
Right.
But when you were there, did you get a sense of that as a kind of political identity? Was it pervasive, or did it seem like maybe some of the press around this has been overstated?
Yeah, I mean, you don't see a lot of signs on of any kind on people's lawns because
because they have a homeowners association that forbids it.
Exactly. Yes. And like part of the story is that, the media, the local paper there, which every single person, it's got crazy circulation numbers because everyone in the villages gets it delivered to them. And it is like directly tied to the company that owns the villages. But like the majority of their coverage is like, this person has gravel in their front yard and it's in violation of the rules and they're still not dealing with. So it's like a very name and shame atmosphere with like anything you do with your home that is wrong. But political signs, the one instance where it came up was I went to lunch with a younger couple. I think they were in their late 50s. And they were not retired yet. So it was kind of weird situation for them being there, in part because they're not super Trump people, but they were a little bit nervous about talking to me because they're still employed, and that perception that the villages is like Trump land or DeSantis land. I mean, the truth is DeSantis has gone there and signed budgets at the villages. It's just like this concentration of it's like 2-to-1 Democrat to Republican registration and people who are highly motivated to get out to vote. So it's definitely like a political, a very concentrated area of for
2-to-1 Republicans, right?
Yes, 2-to-1 Republicans. Sorry if I misstated that. So yeah, the politics are very entwined with the villages, and the fact that they were getting very nervous when all this Disney stuff was going down, and they were very careful not to touch the villages when they were dismantling Reedy Creek because of that.
This sounds like this might be a little bit related to some of the Florida cultural stuff that CJ said he was annoyed with. So, CJ, I want to go to you next. Zach wrote, obviously, about a specific place in Florida that has a reputation for being kind of bizarre and having a very distinctive politics. But you wrote about, well, actually, I just want to read the headline because I do think it's one of the better headlines that we've ever run in Reason Magazine.
You just want to brag on
Monkey
yourself.
herpes. No, I don't even know how this got past the other editors here. But the headline is Monkey Herpes, Face Eating, and the Pork Chop Gang. How public records laws created the Florida man. Like, just a turn every couple of words there. It's great. So this is obviously a piece about the idea of the Florida man, which we've all heard about. And you connect it directly to public policy in the form of Florida's transparency laws. So tell us about the piece, and please help us understand about the monkey herpes and the face eating and the pork chop gang and how they ended up having something to do with public records laws.
Sure. Let me see where to start. Do you want to start with the face eating or the monkey herpes? Or...
I'm going to leave this to you.
Okay. No, so for the latest issue, I wrote about Florida's public records law, which sounds on its face like a dry subject. Most times when you're talking about public records law, it's not the most exciting. But as we all know, that is not the case with things in Florida. Florida, surprisingly, has a really good public record law. Relative to a lot of other states. Like, it is demonstrably better than New York's, California's, Massachusetts, all of these other states that, love to kind of shit on Florida for being, a clown state and stuff like that. They have terrible public records laws compared to Florida's. And my piece sort of looks at how these really good public record laws have contributed, although I wouldn't say created, the phenomena of the Florida man, the meme of, the Florida man headline. Florida man calls 911 to get a ride to Hooters. Florida man walks into a convenience store carrying an alligator, those kind of stories. And the meme, as I go into, the meme itself sort of started in the late to mid 2000s. It really got going on Fark.com, if you guys remember that. It was like a snarky sort of early news aggregator that had like little funny headlines and would just link out to other stories. But they create a Florida tag on their website because the creator just noticed that he kept getting all these insane stories from Florida. So you would just tag them, Florida, Florida, Florida. And over time, people just started, it became this like snowball effect. And then in 2012, there was this actually quite awful incident. It became sort of this running joke, but it was really bad, where a crazy guy attacked a homeless man and started chewing his face off. And it was this huge media sensation. It was like Florida man eats person's face off while on bath salts. Well, in reality, there was never any evidence that guy was on bath salts, which is one of the, sort of complications of the Florida man meme.
He was just on Florida.
He was just high on Florida.
As we all have been at points in our lives.
But so, that was the Florida man meme. But one of the reasons we get these stories is because Florida does really have these good records laws. You can get very prompt police records and mugshots and reports and things like that, which gives news organizations just a real step up when they're reporting this stuff. Florida, Reason's done a lot of Florida-themed stuff. I recently got records from Ron DeSantis' office, speaking of special districts, about his crackdown on drag shows. And we got at least one email where they were talking about retaliating against the Broward Theater that hosted one of these drag shows was in a special county district, special development district. And there was at least one email where they were contemplating like going after the special district because it, the venue was in it and it hosted a drag show. But yeah, so I looked at the history of the Florida Public Records Law as well, which is also a fun Florida story.
And that's the pork chop gang, right?
Yeah, the pork chop gang was a group of Democratic legislators back in the 50s and 60s, and that was back when Democrats were a bit different than they are now in the South.
And also when Democrats were the major party in Florida, right? I mean, Florida was very Democratic for a long time.
Yeah, North and Central Florida, it was basically old Dixiecrats. They were really trying to uphold segregation, try and keep the influence of South Florida and these sort of liberal towns underfoot. And basically the pork chop gang was this block of Southern Democratic legislators who, because of Florida's extremely malapportioned legislative districts, had a complete stranglehold on the state legislature. Nothing could pass without these groups' approval. And so they were also incredibly corrupt. They were using their positions to enrich themselves through secret meetings. And there was one legislator, he was a Democrat as well, but he got fed up with it. He was like, this is actually not good. We shouldn't do this. He met up with some local journalists who also did not like this and started introducing bills to try and get a strong public records law in Florida. His name was Emory Red. His nickname was Red Cross, but he actually gave himself the nickname Red when he campaigned because he thought it would make him more electable. He's like, I'm just a country boy named Red. But it took him a decade to get
marketing in Florida politics.
Yep. It took him a decade to get the law passed because of the pork chop gang. It had no co-sponsors. It died every single year until after the Supreme Court finally struck down Florida's legislative districts because they were so bad. And when they were redrawn, it sort of broke the pork chop gang's stranglehold on politics. And so they were actually finally able to pass this transparency bill. And so that's why we have this really good public records law, is because of Florida's cartoonish corruption. The other fun thing, we need to get to the monkey herpes.
Can't forget the monkey herpes.
We would not. So I was talking, for my article, I talked with Craig Pittman, who is a longtime Florida reporter. He's done a lot of different beats, but he does a lot of environmental reporting as well. And one of the big stories that came out recently was there's an island off of Tampa, like a little island that's filled with a troop of invasive monkeys. And about a quarter of them are infected with herpes B.
Are you sure they're not just residents of the villages?
Yes. I don't think they're in an HOA. I don't think they're governed by an HOA.
They've got rocks in their front yard.
Yeah. So I was talking with Craig
just
about
incredible.
This. Craig was he was pushing back on it a little bit because he was like, well, listen, they're infected with herpes, yes, but they don't really transmit it to people. Like monkeys don't transmit it. There's no cross, vector sort of thing.
I don't know.
But Craig was Craig doesn't he doesn't completely buy into the Florida man was created by public records theory, which I don't think it's a total causality there. I think it contributes, but so yeah, it's just a sort of fun look at Florida's public records law and these sort of wild sort of stories it generated. The most recent Florida man, I think, was a guy who was trying to run across the Atlantic Ocean in a giant inflatable ball, like a big inflatable hamster wheel, and he was trying to run across the ocean in it and got apprehended by the Coast Guard. And it turned out this is like the fourth time the Coast Guard stopped him. His goal,
and there was presumably,
that's what he said. He's like, listen, it's my dream to do this. Why are you stopping me? He's actually is one of the funnest things I found in my article is like, this guy's been stopped 4 times for trying to cross the ocean as an inflatable ball. It turns out he is a Iranian refugee. He was granted asylum and ended up in Florida because, God bless America. That's where you would. Welcome to America. Welcome to Florida. And he's also an ultra marathon runner, like elite athlete. And he decided that what he wanted to do was just run across the ocean in an inflatable ball, but the Coast Guard won't let him. They actually destroyed his inflatable ball a couple times.
See, like when I was growing up in Florida, I thought it was a fairly boring place, and it wasn't until I went to college and then left Florida that I started hearing about the Florida Man meme. And so the Fark.com connection really put everything into place for me. I didn't realize that was the genesis of all this. But I really love the deep Florida history, tracing the origins of the law to the pork chop gang, and then going even further back, you talk about this rogue lieutenant governor who declared his own state government to be run out of a hotel room, from which he was evicted. And then it made me think, is this a potential Trump path, just pretending to rule Florida from Mar-a-Lago just because he hates DeSantis so much right now? I mean, I could see that
the
as
Truman Show version of the Trump presidency would be very entertaining.
Very, yeah.
Which he thinks he's president, or he thinks he's governor, or whatever, but it's just a reality show that all of us can watch without actually having to live in ourselves.
It is very plausible. I mean, we have Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro was in Florida recently. Is Bolsonaro still here?
I don't know. I saw a picture of him just checking out a Publix or something, getting a pub sub. So, yeah.
Getting very excited about the number of Pop-Tarts that are available. Yeah. So your piece, CJ, is it does a good job of kind of limiting this difference between did public records create or did they contribute to, and really, in a way, reveal that what the Florida Man is, and this in some ways goes to the joke about that we made earlier about the bath salts, which is the guy wasn't on bath salts, he was just on Florida. That's just what people are like in Florida. And there's this great quote that you get from Pittman, who is like, well, it's not all in police records. He says, we're the only state with mermaids on the state government payroll. The state employs python hunters. We're the only state where we actually made a hippo an official citizen of the state so he could stay. That's just not something you see anywhere else. Florida is weird, in its DNA. It's not that something made it weird. It's just that it's inherent. That's the nature of the thing. So I actually want to talk to Slade here and bring you in on with your piece. So you wrote about another place in Florida, Key West, in a piece titled "Long Live the Conch Republic." It's a fascinating little history of an island that was initially purchased for $2,000. I'm assuming that's not adjusted for inflation. And then became a bastion of booze and piracy and sex work and resistance to government control. And it sounds like a libertarian paradise to me, right?
So the working title of my piece when I was writing it was "The Always Colorful, Sometimes Libertarian History of Key West." And there's a lot there to love as a libertarian, including the fact that, yes, it was an uninhabited and really uninhabitable island. It has no fresh water. So the idea that this would become a major port was a little bit far-fetched, but it's strategically located between the eastern seaboard and the Gulf of Mexico seaboard. And so somebody saw a business opportunity there, purchased the island for $2,000, and decided to try to make it be, the port, the stop between all, and also the Bahamas as well, and Cuba are all right there, right? So this would be a place to stop off when you're shipping goods between all these places. And surprisingly, it was successful. Yeah, and that's maybe, I open the piece with that anecdote about it being purchased. But my favorite sort of, this is a libertarian kind of place anecdote is about 100 years after that, in the late 1800s, there was a smallpox outbreak in Key West. And so the state of Florida, the government tried to impose a quarantine and close the harbor and, do the things that public health officials like to do in these cases. And there was a revolt by the people of Key West who were like not having it. They were not going to be put into quarantine. They held a public meeting that like 700 people attended during a smallpox outbreak, and one speaker after another talked about how this was ridiculous. The state government has no right to tell us what to do. And at the end of it, they declared their intention, if the state government didn't back off, to secede from Florida.
So Florida has been getting public health policy right for hundreds of years.
Right or wrong, depending on your perspective, yeah.
My favorite anecdote, of course, was the one about the prohibition, and the revenue agents who were just like basically run out of town for trying to actually enforce prohibition in Key West.
Yeah, there were no prohibition agents stationed there, but there were some in Miami who would occasionally come down and do raids. And the people of Key West were like, just fuck this.
But it wasn't just the people though, right? It was the courts were like, also like get out. You guys can't do that.
They basically countersued. They said that they accused the agents of having come in destruction of property, like basically violating our civil rights, and the courts successfully upheld this case. So they both sides settled. So the prohibition agents dropped the charges against the people who were running illegal speakeasies during prohibition, and the city dropped the charges against the agents for basically being dicks.
I also like
CJ, you live in go ahead.
Well, yeah, I was just saying, I also like the anecdote. I guess it was the second secession attempt where it's just like bonking someone on the head, like a naval officer or something on the head with a stale piece of bread, like sort of with his permission. That's like what I love about Florida in general, and the Conch Republic as you portray it in particular is this like sometimes cheeky, but sometimes like very serious disobedience. And like you have a quote in there where they're like the locals are talking about like a sovereign state of mind. Like, this idea of like, Florida as an escape, and like that, whether you're visiting or you're moving, you're kind of escaping something, and that like sovereignty,
possibly the law.
Yeah, very often, especially in like 1950s movies, and it's like sovereignty or liberty as a state of mind is a really powerful concept, and I liked the way that the Conch Republic piece like it encapsulated that.
So CJ, you live in the Keys. Did you see echoes of the current Keys in Slade's piece?
Oh yeah, I mean the Keys are still kind of that place. It's like I do love this sort of spirit. I love the freedom of just getting interrupted by leaf blowers no matter what I try and do.
There's no regulations on that sort of thing in Florida.
My least libertarian opinion?
The free state of Florida does not prohibit gas-powered leaf blowers.
Yeah,
my least libertarian opinion is that gas-powered leaf blowers should be rounded up and publicly destroyed. But no, I loved Slade's piece. It was great. It really captured what makes the Keys, especially Key West, sort of special, is that it's always been sort of a counterculture sort of retreat. There's actually a new documentary that just came out on sort of the counterculture writers and music scene in the early 70s that included Jimmy Buffett, Thomas McGuane, a couple other writers, and they sort of created the current form idea of Key West as this party town. My favorite story is also when Key West tongue-in-cheek seceded in the 80s, they actually went through with it sort of, and they were mad because of a Customs and Border Patrol checkpoint. Everyone in Key West was furious because there was a Border Patrol checkpoint on Highway 1, which is the only way in and out of Key West. So it was jamming up everything. And so they tongue-in-cheek declared that they were seceding. They call themselves the Conch Republic. They made a little flag that says "We seceded where others failed," and that's sort of the key spirit is going your own way and doing it in a good-natured sort of fun attitude, and not taking yourself too seriously. And that's, I think, captures what makes the Keys and a lot of places in Florida pretty special, is that it has that sort of live and let live, leave us alone sort of spirit.
That is how we got Ron DeSantis's COVID-era Florida in a lot of ways. And also, that is a nice segue into our next story, which is mine. You will not be surprised to discover that I wrote about a cocktail. It's called the Bushwacker. It is made of rum, milk, coffee liqueur, cream of coconut. You stick it all in a blender, maybe top it with whipped cream and chocolate sauce. It's sort of a boozy sundae, also sort of a coffee-fied pina colada, especially if you leave off the toppings. Anyway, this was basically the signature drink of the Florida Panhandle, starting in the 1980s after it was brought back from the Virgin Islands, where it was originally a vodka drink, but thank goodness they changed it to rum. And there were bars named after the Bushwacker in the Pensacola area. 2 separate competing beach festivals named after the drink that started, I believe, in the late 1980s. But all of that fell apart when 2 things happened. First, the owner of one of the bars and sort of sponsor of one of these festivals lost the bar after a big cocaine bust. And this is something I didn't get to go into in the piece, so I just want to tell you about it here because it's so perfectly Florida and actually captures a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about throughout the pod, and what CJ was talking about there about just this sort of like gentle live and let live is kind of zaniness, right? There is like a craziness to it, but it's not mean-spirited in a lot of ways, right? And so this cocaine bust was one of the biggest in the Panhandle's history, snapped up dozens and dozens of people, all of whom were apparently very peaceful, just a bunch of buddies. They were like millionaires. There was a substance abuse counselor, hilariously, who was part of this. Some folks who were like school teachers. It was, and like there's all these quotes in the Tampa Bay Times piece that's about this, talking about how like this wasn't your usual gang of like hardened drug traffickers. This was just a bunch of like chilled out weirdos, right? The main dealer is described as a big dumb teddy bear who just happened to deal coke, which is exactly what you meet in Florida. You meet those big dumb teddy bears who just happen to deal coke all the time. The lawyer in the case. Well, I did in fact work at a restaurant in Florida, a beachy restaurant, not quite beachside, but it was basically in the way that the Hard Rock Cafe is like a little cafe that's blown up to serve like a very large number of people. This was the Hard Rock Cafe, except the theme was beach shack, and you could literally write on the walls if you brought a Sharpie in, like right on any surface in this. It was like sort of crappy looking and kind of hacked together by design. Place had a lot of live alligators. We'll talk about that later. But it's just a totally weird and bizarre place, and I'm not going to say that I ever I was involved in a cocaine ring, but there may have been drugs involved in the Florida beach bar scene in the late 1990s. May. But no, the lawyer quote on this was in the story is incredible. This was not your typical cocaine conspiracy. This was something different. It was a cocaine cooperative. It was just a bunch of buds doing cocaine together, driving down to Miami, and then eventually they got caught by the cops. So second, there was another thing that happened in addition to the cocaine bust. There was a big hurricane, and it destroyed a bunch of beach bars in Pensacola. And so the person behind one of these 2 festivals, not the person who lost the bar, but the other one, was worried that this combination of things, somebody losing their bar and the hurricane destroying a bunch of beach bars and a bunch of property, that this might cause some chaos in which someone else could sweep in and take the name Bushwacker Festival and use that and have their own. And so they decided to trademark the name Bushwacker And then, of course, the other person wanted to start the festival back up again later, right? So now you've got two organizations trying to have the two different Bushwacker festivals, one of which has a trademark on it. And so, of course, this went to court and stayed in court for many, 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 many years until a judge finally ruled that the trademark on the festival could stand. However, the trademark for the drink wouldn't apply because it was just a very common drink that everywhere served, that basically every bar on the Florida Panhandle served. And it's just a great Florida story because it involves hurricanes and weird cocaine busts and ridiculous rum cocktails and insane court proceedings. And that's what Florida's like all the time. Also, the drink is pretty delicious if you make it with quality ingredients and a bit of measuring, which I will say is not always how it's actually made in Florida
and
bars.
Our readers will be glad to know that the recipe is printed in this issue of the magazine.
So if you pick up a copy of the magazine, you will learn to make this drink at home. Like I said, I worked at a Florida restaurant, and I want to talk about that in just a minute because what I want to end with here is I think all of us have lived in Florida long enough that we have probably encountered something, an object, a place, a story, an event, a person that just defines the weirdness of Florida. And so I want to just go around here at the end and ask all of you, what is your most Florida story? What is the thing that you have seen or know about or experienced that most encapsulates the idea of Florida to you? And Zach, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, we've already sort of danced around the large reptiles that inhabit this state. And so my story has to involve two of them. The first feature I ever wrote was for my college newspaper, or actually my college magazine at UF, because I'd seen this picture of a python that had attempted to ingest an alligator in the Everglades and just basically exploded. So in this was like the first time anyone, the invasive python problem was just getting started here. So this was the first matchup and it ended in a draw. And I had to go down there and talk to this one guy who was in charge of the python hunting program. And so I drove around the Everglades with him looking for him. Didn't see any, but these were early days. And now, as we know, it's a huge issue with pretty decent bounties for hunting down the pythons. And I think
the pythons are Florida's most successful immigrant population.
I think it's pretty hopeless at this point. They're pretty entrenched down there. The snakes are here to stay. And yeah, it's very Florida to me because first of all, people down here are just really into big reptiles and other large animals that they should not have as pets. That's Florida culture. But then there's the fact that the ecosystem and the nature of Florida is really just so untamable despite all the people that have moved here. The best we can do at some point is just pay people to pull snakes out of estuaries or whatever, and it won't work that well because life finds a way here. And what did work was paying people back when the alligators were endangered. The state government started paying people to preserve habitats on their properties and also work with the alligator farmers. And so there's something to me that's very Florida about you can pay people to to bring back the big reptile we do want, but you can't pay them enough to pull the bad reptile that we don't want out of the water.
That's perfect. CJ, what's your most Florida story or experience?
One time I went out fishing once on Halloween Day a couple of years ago, 3 or 4 now. And I went out fishing. I didn't catch a damn thing. I just spent a few hours sitting around, throwing my line in the water, getting my bait taken and reeling it back in. I got done and I drove. I was out in the mangroves pretty far, but there is a biker bar that is just in the middle of nowhere when you're going. There's 2 ways into the Keys. There's the main highway and a back road. And on the back road, there is just a biker bar in the middle of nowhere called Alabama Jack's. And so after I was done fishing, I stopped by there for a beer, and it was Halloween day, and there was a band playing, like a trio, old guys, like an old man cover band. But one guy was on steel guitar, and then there was a bass and a drummer. I was sitting there having a beer, and they played a alt country cover of Monster Mash. So I was just sitting in the mangroves drinking a beer and listening to like a twangy steel guitar version of Monster Mash. You know, 'twas a graveyard smash. And I say, this is pretty Florida. There's like a cat running around the bar and bikers. It was a great day. Those are the kind of moments where you're like, this state, there's a lot of nonsense in this state. This sort of like good-natured charm that Peter and I were talking about has been kind of disappearing as the cultural politics have gotten nastier and nastier. But you still get these little moments where you just go out and you just hit these really weird cultural mashups in places. Like I went into Little Havana once and I heard an Afro-Cuban jazz combo doing an insanely funky cover of the Michael Jackson song from Free Willy. Do you guys remember that song?
Yes.
It took me a while. I was sitting there, I'm like, damn, what is that song? Oh my God, it's the Free Willy song, except it was like just like booty shaking funky. And I was like, this is incredible. I love Miami.
The music culture in Florida is so fascinating because there's so many of these kind of beachside cover bands and folks who play in these bands for decades, and they don't play for the most part they don't play originals, but they're often quite good musicians, good performers whose job isn't to be famous. Their job is to entertain a few hundred people, every evening while they sit back and drink a Miller Lite or a Bushwacker. We had a cover band at the bar and restaurant that I worked at that played quite a few nights, and they just had this repertoire that they would run through, and it was their job wasn't to be a band where, you came to see their songs. It was you heard the songs that were already being played on the radio, and people loved it. Slade, what's your most Florida story?
Okay, so apparently 3 out of 4 of us are going to be talking about large reptiles. Actually, South Florida is the only place on Earth where there are both alligators and crocodiles coexisting.
Did you learn as a young person living in Florida how to tell the difference?
Oh yeah.
Because was the cue?
Do kids not learn that other places?
I when I was in North Carolina as like a 5-year-old, that was not something that was on my mind. And then I moved to Florida at 8 or 9 years old, and it was immediately told, you have to watch out for it. And what were the differences you were told to watch out for?
Oh, the shape of the snout.
Yes.
Right. So it's either a U shape, and that's an alligator, like a sort of wider, thicker snout, or it's a V shape, or it's triangle shape, and that's a crocodile.
Yes, and also, by the way, I can something about like the teeth sticking up
yes.
From the crocodile, right? So
yes, and I can confirm I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old who will both be able to explain in detail to you the difference between a crocodile and an alligator. So this is like need to know knowledge down here.
If you're walking in an area with nature and you're thinking, that's just a log. It's not a log. It's an alligator. And the way to provoke them is to step on them. I'm sorry. We all have so much alligator knowledge. I just want to stop and highlight that for a moment.
So when I was pretty new at Reason, one of my assignments was to interview Glenn Garvin, who is a sort of unofficial Miami correspondent for us for many years. And he told this story about how one of the things he loves about Miami is just the people watching and the stories. And he said one time a guy irritated with his service at a fast food joint threw a crocodile through the drive-up window. A live crocodile, I might add, because we're not believers in empty symbolism around here. We're all about making it real. And I loved that quote, and it really does sum up something about Miami and Florida more generally. And I'll say, as a student at the University of Florida, one of the sort of very popular activities is to go tubing on the Ichitucknee River. And there's some other rivers around there where you can go tubing. You get a big inflatable tube and you drink beers and you float down the river. And I did that as a teenager, as a college student. And when I think back on that, I think that is completely insane. There were definitely alligators and there were definitely snakes in that water. I don't know what we were thinking. I would never do that again.
So my story also involves alligators. Like I said, I worked at a restaurant that had live alligators. And so I think the first year I was there, they didn't. But this was a feature. They built a little swamp area. You could pay to buy food and then lower food off of like a sort of a stick with a string, lower food, right? Because the thing about alligators, and is that they don't move very much. And if you got alligators there for the tourists, you want them to move around and do stuff. And the way you get them to move around and do stuff is you put alligator snacks on a string at the end of a stick, and you let the tourists feed the alligators, and so they'll sort of move up and then snap that food off of the end of the string. And of course, because these are tourists in the redneck Riviera, some of the tourists will inevitably use that string to create a noose and attempt to pull the alligators out of the alligator pen. So eventually, of course, they had to hire a bunch of extra people whose job was not to sell the food, but to sell the alligator snacks to the tourists, but instead to make sure that all of the tourist teenagers were not trying to put the alligators in nooses and pull them out into the public areas. But that is not even my story. My story is I was a server there during the summers to help pay for college. And this was a place that had 3-hour waits every night. It was very intense, sat 600 people at its, in a peak of the evening. And so, of course, there was always a big line at the hostess stand. And one day, a woman came in. This was after a big storm. And a woman came in and knew that we had alligators and dropped off an alligator. A 2.5-foot alligator at the hostess stand. And of course, all the the teenagers working at the hostess stand are like, what do we, I don't know. The manager wasn't there. They had to go get a manager. By the time they brought the manager back, the woman who dropped off the alligator had gone. Of course, her alligator had washed up into her swimming pool because there was a big storm the previous day. And this is a very common thing. You would just find alligators in your swimming pools, in your backyards in the panhandle of Florida. And so somebody decided to drop one off at the restaurant thinking, oh, they have alligators. They can just take them. Well, of course you can't. There's a whole bunch of regulations that say what you can and can't do with live alligators especially a restaurant. And you can't take those and feed them, you can't take those and eat them, right? Even though we did serve fried alligator at the restaurant, you could only source your live alligators from an alligator farm in South Central Florida. That was what was licensed. So all of these swimming pool alligators were definitely off limits. So the manager eventually came back. The woman was gone. They were left with this alligator there. What do we do here? We've got to call Fish and Game. And so that's going to, the Fish and Game people, that's going to take hours for them to come out on a summer Tuesday evening. And their solution was, well, we got to keep this alligator here. We don't know what we can do with it. So they bound it up in rubber bands so that its mouth couldn't open, and then stuck it in a 5-gallon sauerkraut bin and left it at the silverware table where you had to go grab silverware for your customers every time that the table turned over. And so for a whole night, I waited tables while occasionally having a nice little conversation with this alligator who had been stuck in the sauerkraut bin at the silverware counter waiting for Fish and Game to show up. And that is, in fact, what it is like in Florida all the time. Florida is a python eating an alligator and the python's gut exploding. It's a steel guitar cover of Monster Mash at Biker Jack's, or whatever that place was called, after a day spent fishing. It's a guy throwing a crocodile through a drive-through window. It's an alligator in a sauerkraut bin at a crazy tourist restaurant. Thanks to my fellow Floridians for joining me today, and thanks to all of you out there for listening. Remember, this is a Webathon week. To support Reason, to make more Florida content possible, please go to reason.com/donate. That's reason.com/donate. I'm Peter Suderman, and this has been the Reason Podcast.